Shock Piece: The Search for Freedom, a novel by C. Nguyen. Chapter 21: Re-Education Camps and Tuan, the Lieutenant. It was lucky for Tam that his sister had some jewelry left. She sold it to give him extra cash to start his business in second-hand wares. He was to manage this for her, and they were helping each other get food and everything else with the income. Her husband was in what the communists called a re-education camp, one of the many thousand camps scattered around the country. Re-education my foot, Tam spat out disgustedly. It's a jail that he's in. They do not even have the decency to say it, deceiving bastards. Tuan was an army lieutenant of the previous regime, and like most of the prisoners in his country's post-war period, he did not have the slightest idea how long he was going to be in for. He had said goodbye to his young wife in the morning, light-heartedly, reporting to his allocated center and feigning the belief of going to a job interview. The elation of knowing that he was going to be recruited back into the civil service was high. Didn't they say so? Tuan muttered to himself. A few weeks of disturbing uneasiness had passed after the fall, and everyone was dispirited and anxious about what was going to happen. Then there were announcements from the new Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam about self-reporting for classification. All American ex-employees, personnel of the previous Thiel's puppet regime, and ex-servicemen of the previous armed forces of the Republic of South Vietnam are to report to their allocated centers for re-registration. The PRG of South Vietnam is encouraging voluntary registration and is willing to recruit everyone for his service in reconstructing Vietnam back to its glorious state under the true leadership of the Vietnamese Communist Party. However, if you refuse to come forward, then you will be faced with severe punishment. Ha! So much for voluntary registration. They're so clever with words. Don't you dare not to, many had cried out in their discussion of going or not going. The officials also said you are to bring enough food, money, and personal belongings for 10 days when reporting for high-ranking armed forces officers, lieutenants, and up or similar. There were others who were less important and who were to be in for 3 days or so. It was announced. I'll be back soon, darling. Leave the boxes of old clothes there for me. Don't bother to tax yourself with them. I'll put them away when I come back home. They embraced in silence. She tried to put on a brave face for her husband, but inside, Tan was tormented with weariness. Her gut knotted into a tight ball of apprehension. Somehow Tan was afraid. She was petrified of the future and could sense its horror. Tuan was a southerner, kind and gullible. The Viet Cong were never to be trusted. She had known that from her late father. He often told her so from his experience escaping to the south in the exodus of 1954, after the division of Vietnam by the French at the 17th parallel. She shared his terror from many unbelievable stories he had witnessed. Dan wanted to cry, wailing out loud to let this feeling of foreboding spill out of her chest, but she restrained herself. Tuan had enough to worry about at that moment. He seemed so relaxed. Tan addressed her husband unflinchingly. You take care, darling. I'll be okay. It's only 10 days. I'm going to count, and it's going to end before I even remember it. Tuan gently stroked his wife's long straight hair and landed a gentle kiss on her forehead. Yes, sweetheart. It won't be long at all. Don't you worry, Tan, and I'll be back before you know it, baby. Then he held her tighter and said quietly, Don't cry, darling. The moment Tan heard her husband say, Don't cry, darling, tears started streaming down her face uncontrollably, regardless of the effort she made to hold them back. She buried her face in Tuan's shoulder, holding him against her body with all her strength, sniffing in his maleness, and repeatedly soaking in his scent and sobbing intermittently in her anguish, trying desperately to stifle her crying lest it turn into a wail of despair. She was already missing him. How was she able to go on living without him after a so short period of rejoicing in togetherness? Tuan shuddered involuntarily. He wished he could relieve his wife of her distress by doing something other than just offering vague reassurance. Please don't cry, Tan. I'll be back soon. The war's over. The country's at peace. And we're all safe now. Tan blubbered apologetically between hiccups. I'm so sorry, darling, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be so. She could not utter another word and left the sentence unfinished. Then, breathing deeply to regain her composure, Tan stepped away from her husband. She looked up at his beloved, rugged, weather-beaten face. He saw his strong, determined, square jaw tighten, and his intelligent eyes overflow with tenderness for her. She took it all in and stood still, trying to memorize the whole picture, arms hanging lamely at her sides, afraid of moving a muscle lest she start bawling once more. Tuan turned abruptly, hitched his satchel containing his belongings for 10 days onto his shoulder, and walked away quickly out of the door. He did not look back, afraid of being disheartened at the tear-streaked face of his dear young wife, and succumbing to the weakness of not reporting. But he had to go. Tuan had pondered the option of not reporting many times, but he finally decided to go forward and start life all over again as a good citizen in a united Vietnam, as everyone else had hoped to do. Tan did not know that that was the last time she would ever look into her husband's eyes or breathe in his scent. The Re-Education Camp, June 1975. Tuan was a mechanical engineer before being drafted into the army and was trained in the Reserved Officer Training Academy School of Tu Duc before going to war with the rank of First Lieutenant. He had only recently been promoted to Second Lieutenant and then to Lieutenant after the bloody battles of An Loc in 1972, just a few months after he graduated from his army school. Now, after the war ended, he was restless and worried. A young and heroic lieutenant in the war would not be in a pleasant position on the defeated side at all. Tuan knew that. He was in for a hard ride, and he was in some danger from the attention of the communists. Many times at night, he wanted to tell Tan that he had to leave her and follow some of his mates into the jungle to form a military resistance against the invading northerners. The thought of doing something to salvage the respectability of the South Vietnamese army was burning inside his chest, but in the end, he sadly abandoned the noble urge. He was home after the war now. His wife had him in her arms at last. He could not bring himself to tell her that he had to go again so soon. He would try to be with her for a little while at least. Tuan resigned. It was only 4 months after their marriage in early 1972 that he had gone away to battle and had only managed a few weeks here and there together since then. 3 years had gone by, and they had hardly had any time jointly as husband and wife. She loved him dearly, and he was lucky to have her in his life. They felt complete being with each other. Happiness had been fragile in the past. Every time he said goodbye to her to go to combat, it was as if they were saying farewell for good. The nightmare that his young wife might have to endure seeing him brought home on a stretcher was torture enough to keep Tan worried sick. Every time she heard of the death count in battles, Tan just had to pray. She chanted in her head that she would go through the day as normally as she could, and was only relieved when she heard his voice again on the phone. The life of a soldier's wife in wartime was tragic. At last, no more fighting and no more combats. They needed time for each other. Tan was hopeful. Peace and happiness was short-lived, as always. They only had a few weeks together. Then the new government announced mandatory self-reporting, and the informers around his neighborhood would not let him stay in peace for sure. They would very gladly point their fingers and drag him out in the open if he did not come out himself. He was famous for his courage in battles, and they all knew about his distinguished service in the South Vietnamese army. He had to go to the reporting center to avoid all the complications at home. It was not only that. The new government had promised an understanding and a recruiting scheme to place men back into the civil service. He hoped he could contribute his skills to rebuilding the country if they would allow him. After all, the war was over. Vietnam had had this fight for so long. It would be best if peace was actually here. Tuan was trying to believe in the promises. He had to reassure himself repeatedly for his wife's sake. He had to put on a cheerful air for her. The moment Tuan stepped onto the re-education campground, he knew that he was in for good. His belief of being treated fairly shattered into pieces. That was very clever of them, Tuan thought. The cruelty of the North Vietnamese communists was in naming their concentration camps around the country re-education camp. Here they would keep millions of former officers in the armed forces like him, religious leaders and employees of the Americans or of the Vietnamese Republic government detained without trials. They were not for criminals because they were not called jails, but the primary purpose of the re-education camp was to retrain the minds of detainees into thinking along communist lines and to learn the Communist Party and their leader, Ho Chi Minh. The term re-education in English is not strong enough to translate. The term re-education is not strong enough to translate the original Vietnamese. The mentioning of the original terms raised hell in the mind of all Southerners. It was nothing relating to education, but literally an attempt at redesigning the mind, or reprogramming the brain, clearing away all the softwares, and making over sinful or incomplete individuals. The hidden horrors in those re-education camps have not yet been exposed to the outside world, even though the stories of many survivors who fled to other countries were shocking and their painful memories might never heal. In reality, after a few days, Tuan realized that the new government had invented that system to give free rein to their communist members, to punish the South Vietnamese armed forces personnel with slow death, humiliation, and torture to satisfy their savagery and revenge. Look at their camp officers. Tuan was horrified to see that the party allowed members who were barely high school graduates the roles of camp officers as rewards for their loyal support after their victory. They could not even spell lieutenant when Tuan told them his rank. After reporting to headquarters with name and rank, the officers were categorized and transported to various camps by army buses in the dark of the night for secrecy. The level of security and treatment toward the inmates were already decided by their rank and divisions. Few generals and many majors and captains had realized belatedly that they were in for a nasty surprise, though some had known that they might not see their family again. Looks of alarm and apprehension were exchanged silently. Some were quite calm and indifferent, but still sad and sorrowful. Some were in panic and fear. The chill was there in the air, even though the temperature was over 30 degrees Celsius in the crowded bus. Then on the first day at the camp, everyone was gathered into small groups of 10 or 20, and they started by telling the officers to write down detailed confessions of their supposed crimes. Each was given a blank notebook and a pencil. You are here to confess to the party your evil and treacherous crimes of the past. Spare no details, and using your own words, you must not try to deceive us. Any attempt of omitting your heinous acts in the war will be punished, as they will be revealed eventually. Take heed and spill it all out, you traitors and enemies of the Vietnamese Communist Party. Tuan was utterly confused about what crime he had committed, as he believed in his country, the South. He thought his service toward the country was to be drafted into the armed forces and to fight as a soldier protecting the borders and his countrymen. He believed it was his duty as a citizen. He did not betray the homeland he grew up in. He was not a defiler like many of the double-crossers who received nourishment and flourished in the southern part of the country and served the other party unashamedly. They were what he thought fit to be called traitors, and Tuan had done nothing wrong in that context to be named one. Bluntly, Tuan refused to write anything other than, I was a South Vietnamese soldier. I am living in the south of Vietnam. which is my homeland, and I belong to the South Vietnamese government. I did what a citizen of a country had to do for his motherland in a time of crisis. I did nothing wrong, and I was not a traitor. Of course, he was singled out, and his life had been hell since then. He was summoned to their office the following morning and was made to face a primitive trial by 3 northerner military officers without any defense assistants on his side. His hands were tied behind his back by the guards. The other prisoners were rounded up outside to witness his sentencing. They were squatting on the dirt under the heat of the rising sun. The armed guards were scattered in pairs around the assembly. There was a company of 80 soldiers at least for the 200 officers. The background of the interrogating room was decorated with 2 flags, the 2 red-blue halves, with the yellow star of the Revolutionary Army, and the main red one, the yellow star of the Communist Party. A portrait of Ho Chi Minh stared at Tuan. It hung high above the flags, an indication that the communists do not consider their country's flag as a priority, but they worship their leader more than anything else. Beneath the framed portrait was a banner that said, "Long live Uncle Ho, our greatest and esteemed leader." The officers were all sitting at the rectangular table, their faces grim and their backs to the wall. There were 2 guards with AK-47 machine guns standing at the entrance. They were young and undersized in their light green army uniforms and were probably 18 or 19 at most. The gun they carried had lost its menace as it seemed they were mere boys playing at dressing up and playing soldiers. The anticipation of witnessing the humiliation of a vanquished South Vietnam lieutenant by their higher-ranked comrades was evident in their eyes as youngsters normally were. They were curious, as Tuan's reputation as a rebellious prisoner was already spreading through the camp. The young soldiers took turns on guard to watch his reaction, as if it were a scene in a violent movie. The room was bare, even without a chair for Tuan to sit on. He was forced to stand facing them and the red background. There were 2 other big slogans saying all dedication and gratefulness toward Great Uncle Ho and the Communist Party, and long live the Vietnamese Communist Party, written on red banners with yellow words, spreading across the room. How he hated the face of Ho Chi Minh, their flags, and the madness of his doctrines. The past leader of the Vietnamese Communist Party was evidently influential even now after his death. He had injected into the mind of his followers, especially the illiterate peasants, the hatred of capitalists and Americans. The whole population, approximately 40 million Vietnamese in the North at that time, believed blindly in his propaganda in pursuing the advance of communism in the South. He had kept pushing forward relentlessly to take over control of the South until his death in 1969. In his propaganda, he used the bitter history of foreign oppression of ancient Vietnam in the past 1,000 years. Through 1,000 years of intermittent Chinese invasion and the last 100 years of French occupation, to instill extreme abhorrence of foreign invasion in the mind of the Northerners and a fair proportion of Southerners. He then proclaimed to his followers that the presence of the Americans on Vietnamese soil was oppression, and accused the government of South Vietnam of being a puppet authority on which the Americans exerted their influence. For over 20 years, under his constant fanaticism, leadership, and profound influence even after his death, Vietnam had suffered a long and tedious civil war. The whole country had endured destruction, death, and misery instead of advancement and development after the French Revolution in 1954. That was also the harshest blow. The French retaliated against Vietnam for overthrowing its 100-year rule by dividing the country in half. Instead of leaving Vietnam total freedom to choose which version of capitalism or communism to follow, the French had simply divided the country in half. How could the country be united without civil war? The inevitable outcome was the sorrow of Vietnam and its citizens through bloodshed and carnage. His disgust in looking at the red background must have shown on his face. The officers were even more vicious. They did not leave him a chance to defend himself, but sentenced him on the spot as an enemy of the people of the Vietnamese Communist Party for being a lieutenant who had killed thousands of their people in combat during his service in the South Vietnamese Army since 1972. Of the three army officers, the highest ranking was the first lieutenant, about Thuan's age. The first lieutenant was the one who delivered the verdict. There is proof that you are an enemy of the Vietnamese Communist Party and the people of Vietnam. You killed our comrades, our people. You betrayed the Communist Party, and you collaborated with the capitalists and the Americans. You are to change your attitude and mental outlook and learn to become a believer in communism and a worshipper of Great Uncle Ho. Your sentence is final, and the duration of your stay and hard labor is determined by your records and confessions. You have to prove yourself free of all the crimes you've committed until the Communist Party and the people are satisfied with your sincere conversion. Then you will be absolved and granted graduation and freedom. That was so strange and vague a sentence that Thuan heard it in shocked disbelief. They were playing God, not acting as government officials. He did not know whether it was a joke they were playing on his mind or a sickening way of asserting their primitive notions of human rights. To admit to their accusations, Thuan had to deny his underlying nationalist principles, distort the real truth, refute his army brotherhood, and disown his ex-government in order to say what he did was wrong. The bottom line was not that he must satisfy them by the sincerity of his confession, but that they must satisfy themselves when they were through with him, Thuan believed. How was he to satisfy their specifications without the simplest guideline, when he was given only a blank notebook to write in? His fellow army officers must have felt despaired of having to condemn their own patriotic acts. Or perhaps it was the single-minded confession that the communists wanted to hear from the Southerners, that they were all traitors. How was he to prove himself free of his crimes if all he had done was to protect himself and his countrymen in battle? They wanted to demonstrate that the South had had no real cause. They wanted to humiliate the South Vietnam Republic and the whole population of the South so that he and everyone else were traitors in the end. Sadly, they were gaining ground as time went by, since many camp prisoners had to tailor their confessions and betray other inmates for imaginary crimes in order to prove their sincerity, be absolved by the party, and get out of this horror. He spat on the floor and shouted, "Damn you and your Communist Party! Fuck your rotten Uncle Ho! You're all primal apes and illiterate stupid puppets who are very lucky to be alive today because I did not have a chance of finishing you off in battle." Thuan was silenced immediately as one of the guards brought the butt of his AK-47 down hard against his head. Blood spurted from a gash behind his ear, and his body collapsed in a heap. The other guard ran forward, thumping his rifle repeatedly into Thuan's shoulders and back in a fit of rage. They all stood over him, cursing vehemently. "How dare you? Bastard, you're going to hell and back. Insolent traitor, you dare to insult Great Uncle Ho and the party? You won't live to see daylight, son of a bitch. Stupid, stupid, stupid. You're going to eat your own shit, I swear to that." Dan was shaking with anger. Thuan realized belatedly that he had touched their nerves by his profanity involving Great Uncle Ho. They only stopped swearing and pouting him when Thuan had ceased to move. Mercifully, he had passed out. The guards then took his legs and pulled him toward the metal box in the middle of the field. His hands were still tied behind his back. The trail of blood was bright red on the dirt, like the color of the banner and their communist flag. They shoved him in, locked the door, and left him there, showing no concern over his head wound. Some of the officers in the crowd stood up when they saw Thuan's body dragged out of the room. A muffled cry of shock was heard in the silence. The other guards immediately moved forward and pointed their AK-47 at them, ready to fire. Those who stood up were pushed down violently. One was knocked down in the stomach with a rifle butt for being a bit slow, surprised at seeing the first victim of violence on the first day at camp. The officer doubled over in pain, but managed to yell, "Damn you savages from the north, go to hell." In return for that outburst, he was shackled and tied under the flagpole for a whole day as punishment. To the officer, his surprise at the level of brutality of his own countrymen did not lessen but increased in intensity as the hours passed. He could not comprehend the animosity and the malice the northerners showed towards the southerners. It seemed totally unnatural. He stopped counting the days of his stay as time passed, and his hope of returning home receded into the farthest corner of his mind. It was too distressing to think about. Today was another day. With his hands bound behind his back like many days before, Tuan stood in front of a young official who looked barely more than 20. The face was typical of a North Vietnamese. The body was malnourished and short through years of jungle fighting. The eyes were small and elongated. The skin was sallow and blotchy due to prolonged periods of hiding in dark places. The lips were thin and the mouth protruded, with his front teeth exposed as if unable to close his lips. It was even worse as the teeth were yellowish and blackish with tar. There were bits of meat on his right chipped incisors, he realized. Marvelous bits of meat. Dan smiled gladly. For the last few months after the victory of the Communist Party over South Vietnam, he and his comrades were given meat to eat every week. That was the best treat he had ever received from the party and Great Uncle Ho. In his entire life as a communist follower, he had never been so contented. The fat goose of the South was the reward in the end. He was grateful, and even he had the role of commander of this camp. He could not believe his luck when they told him about that. He had never dreamt of having this great power in his entire life. Dan felt very important and proud of his authority, and the power of controlling so many cocky and pompous South Vietnamese officers and soldiers made his head swell enormously. Those assholes must pay dearly for his suffering over the years. He rummaged in his left shirt pocket, took out a bamboo toothpick and reached into the chipped teeth, pulling out a bit of meat between the cracks, observing it, and then bringing it closer to his nose. He inhaled its smell and put the bits back into his mouth joyfully, smacking his lips with satisfaction. He carefully replaced the toothpick back in his shirt pocket for later use. It should not go to waste. Nothing should go to waste. He had learnt that in his life as a communist soldier in the war, there were times when he was in the jungle, down in the dark, treacherous Gucci tunnels fighting as a guerrilla, and his longing for a decent meal was more than anything he could think of at that time. The impossible claustrophobic living conditions and the fear of death still gave him nightmares now and then. It was over now. Now it was changing for the party and for people like him. It was time to enjoy the feast of victory. It was the work of Great Uncle Ho. Dan had to remember that. His Uncle Ho had the insight of persistently pushing forward. Obviously, his clever Uncle Ho had known of the gold mines that the South offered. There were the riches of the fertile land, the food, the rice, the comfort of living, and the various magnificent jewelry and machinery that added many luxurious aspects of civilization that he and his comrades had never thought possible. Dan glanced at his watch. The short hand was at number 7, and the long hand was at number 12. It was 7 o'clock exactly. He beamed with pleasures, feeling very smart. Dan was taught how to tell the time by one of his comrades. He loved the look of his watch and the sensational feeling it had given him when he took the Seiko wristwatch off Tuan the moment he had seen it. The day after, he gleefully wrote to his wife living in the outskirts of Hanoi and boasting of having a wristwatch with no driver and 2 windows. He meant an automatic wristwatch with date and month windows, a precious treasure that many of his villagers would envy, as none could afford such a luxury. His dedicated service to the Communist Party and Great Uncle Ho had paid off at last. Dan felt grateful again. Reluctantly, taking his eyes away from his now beloved watch, he shoved Tuan forcefully between his shoulders and arrogantly ordered, "Kneel and bow to the Communist Party, to great Uncle Ho, and to me, low-life traitor." The routine humiliation had been repeated every morning for the last 3 weeks. The 10 days' detention per the announcement had now passed, and Tuan knew that he was in for a long time. He did not know where he was at the moment. His senses were all numbed by repeated torture. They put him in a metal box under the hot sun for increasing durations, and reduced his water allowance every day. It was the 7th day consecutively, and Tuan was already weak with exhaustion. He fell over face down and crumpled onto the earthen floor with the slightest shove. Tuan regained his senses with a dry mouth and a severe headache. He lay still, listened to his labored breathing, and wondered why. He thought he was having a dream, that he was in the desert and had no water. It was hot. The temperature in the metal box was 45 degrees Celsius at least. He was sweating profusely. That did not help with his thirst at all, Tuan realized. He managed to lick the beads of sweat that trickled down his lips. It was salty, but it eased his dry mouth a bit. There was no space to move. I must be in a coffin in my dream, Tuan thought. Slowly, everything became clearer. He remembered now. He was sentenced to a slow death, and this was the first day. Tuan closed his eyes and pictured the face of Tan in his mind, trying to obliterate the pain. He wished that he had kissed his wife on the day he left home. Lying in his cell, Tuan often reflected. Ironically, like him, millions of South Vietnamese, indeed the whole population of the South, foolishly believed the new government when asked to report to various headquarters to make self-declarations along with statements of their occupation, position, and rank, as well as confessing to whatever crimes they thought had been committed against the Communist Party through the duration of their service for the government of the Republic of Vietnam. Like him, many had willingly stepped forward, and all were tricked into believing in reclassification and recruitment into new government positions. The whole of the South fell headfirst into the trap of the new regime. Like him, they believed in peace, unity, and their ability to contribute to the reconstruction of the whole nation. That belief was shattered by the betrayal of the Communist Party and its treatment of 2.5 million South Vietnamese men in its re-education camps. The victors kept their countrymen in these concentration camps for indefinite terms without bringing formal charges or conducting judicial proceedings of any kind. They killed approximately 165,000 men in more than 200 camps in the vicinity of Hanoi and Saigon for over 12 years after the fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975. It was another day as many previous days. His interrogators seemed to enjoy each torture session in the last 10 days. However, they were getting tired of the game. They were not making progress. They were sick of Tuan and his stubbornness. They needed a new victim. He refused to admit and confess his crimes and was still cocky, even in his weakened condition. But his punishment was a good example for the rest of his inmates, Dan thought. He still served their purpose anyhow. Dan ushered the other 2 officers toward the interrogation room. His voice was chirpy. "Come on, comrades. Let's get it over quickly today so we can enjoy our card game sooner. The bastard is not going to last very long, and he stinks. It's revolting. He's ruining my appetite, and I don't like anything affecting that. Just another round or so, and we're done with the motherfucker. It's strange that he's still alive. He must come from a good stock." He chuckled at his own logic. Then, looking up to the sunny sky, he said, "It's bloody hot today. We're having chicken for lunch with cabbage salad. The canteen has already prepared the chooks." Smacking his lips in anticipation of the meal, he went in and changed his expression immediately into a mask of malevolence and arrogance. The guards pulled Tuan out of his metal box by his legs, one on each side, put him on a stretcher, and carried him in. Tuan was no longer able to stand, so they left him lying on the ground. The first lieutenant was always the first with a stream of hostile words, his face distorted with rage and his eyes blaring. He shouted, "You son of a bitch! You're the enemy of the people of the Communist Party of the great Uncle Ho. How dare you deny your sin and you still think you can get away with it? How dare you refuse to accept your crimes? Filthy bastard, scumbag traitor." The other followed quickly with more accusations. "You killed our comrades and collaborated with the Americans in the An Loc battle that sabotaged many of our efforts to liberate the South and unite the country in 1972. We've got evidence and witnesses who are ready to come forward to testify. No way you can deny that, you low-life traitor." Dan was the last. "You cunning, bloodthirsty backslider. 3 of our best divisions engaged in those battles with T-54 tanks, and you son of a bitch prevented us from taking over An Loc." He kicked Tuan with his right foot, pushing him onto his side. In a delirium of exhaustion, Tuan heard them mention the An Loc battle and smiled despite his weakness. It was a glorious victory for his battalion and the South Vietnamese army in April 1972. They had managed to defeat 3 North Vietnamese divisions, an estimated 36,000 troops supported by T-54 tanks with their humble M72 machine guns. They were useless against the heavy Soviet tanks unless fired with total precision and a bit of luck. They drove the Northerners back to the border in disarray, their army in retreat, despite greatly outnumbering South Vietnamese soldiers. He drifted in and out of consciousness. In tiny fractions when his mind was clear, Tuan was indeed glad that he was leaving this hell on earth. He was so hot. His lips were parched and bleeding. He had a high fever. His head wound was badly infected, and there were maggots in the yellow pus forming around his ear. Some blackened crusts of old blood matted his hair. His white shirt was filthy and smelt of vomit, and his trousers were loose on his skeletal body. The stench of urine and feces filled the room. Dan had made sure his vow was carried out by ordering the guards to smear feces on Tuan's face. The guards and the interrogators had to use handkerchiefs on their noses to block out the smell. Their disgust was visible, and they were glad that Tuan was fading. Today was the last day of interrogation. They would carry him back to his bed and leave him there to die. They were done with him. He was beyond help. There was no way they could convert him into thinking as a communist. What a stupid fool.